Hi there, good evening. Yes, so after that introduction, I'll see what I can do to tell you about building a team and creating an inclusive working environment. It was interesting on the weekend, that's a picture of me, it was my birthday on the weekend in Malaysia, and they surprised me with a cake and everything, so that's hopefully what we're trying to achieve there as a team that's working out in Malaysia last week. Now, who am I and how do I fit in with the Saïd Business School? So, as I said, I'm from Australia originally, and about 20 years ago, I came over to the UK because I tried to start my racing car company in Australia and went to Malaysia in order to try and sell cars there, and they said to me that they couldn't buy cars off me unless I could help the people in Malaysia get into Formula One, and I couldn't at the time, so I packed up my bags and came over to the UK to work in Formula One. Over about 10 or 15 years, I worked for a various number of F1 teams, including Arrows and McLaren, where I got different viewpoints on how racing teams work, from small teams like Arrows up to big teams like McLaren. And I'll hopefully touch on some of those ideas and what I took from some of those racing teams and put into one of my startups, which was Super Aguri. I did my EMBA here at Oxford in about 2005. And at the time, I decided to come and do the MBA and try my luck at starting my own Formula One team, which was, most people thought I was crazy, but I sort of soldiered on anyway. In these photos here, you kind of got, there's me at one of the dinners here in Christchurch, I think it was, all the way through to being interviewed at the racetrack. I started the team while I was doing the MBA, so it was quite an interesting experience. I did a lot of study on the planes, coming back from races around the world. I think I wrote a few papers while at tests in Italy and places like that, and some of my friends here printed them out and took them out. Took my assignments for me to the exam school. But over the course of the MBA, I was able to live sort of check how I was going with the team. I came back to many lectures and asked lots of questions and had a sort of a big feedback loop from my MBA. So what did we do? Well, the first, let's say, big startup was we started a race team called Super Aguri. This was in 2005. What I'd been doing was I sort of started off by saying, I'm going to start a Formula One team. Now, I think many of you have probably got some ideas and are looking to start your own businesses. And I'm very much a person who says you've got to go out there and just tell people what you're going to do. So I just kind of went out there and said, I'm going to start a Formula One team. Most people thought we were very crazy, but we kept sort of plowing on. Now, it took us about, I think we were working on the project for about a year and we're almost ready to give up. And we had all the plans in place. We knew what we were going to do. We knew who we were going to hire. We'd talked to people for the whole year previously. And then along came the right investor, which was basically Honda and a guy called Aguri Suzuki, who became our partner. So one of the things that I sort of noticed was that, okay, how do we get something started in a very short time? We basically started in about October in 2005, and we had what we worked out to be roughly 100 days to get from zero to a race in the Middle East, in Bahrain. So 100 days, 22 tons of equipment, and 96 employees later, we had a race team and we were in the Middle East racing. Now that's a pretty difficult startup, and it couldn't have happened unless we did it in the cluster. Now you're probably wondering about clusters. In the UK, in this area, in Motorsports Valley we call it, we have, I think it's 7 of the 10 Formula One teams and many of the other racing teams that operate around the world. They all work out of what we call a cluster, and a cluster is that there's a large amount of companies that are similar type in the one area. Why does that make it easier? Well, if you're looking for people in a cluster, very much like if you're working in Silicon Valley, for example, and I'll use that as an example later on, it's easier to find people when you're inside a cluster. Labor mobility is higher, and that means that if you get fired by one of the companies that's in a very similar sector, it's much easier to find a job when you're in a cluster. And so if you're a startup company and you're trying to start something, then if you start inside a cluster, you're more likely to be able to get people at short notice. You'll be able to find good people coming out of various companies, whether those companies have failed or whether or not that person is looking for something new to do. So that's why I think starting up in a cluster is most important. That's one of the, this comment here, this was used in a government presentation by the MIA, which is the Motorsport Industry Association, and they used this slide in one of their presentations, and one of my comments was that there's no way we could have done this in any other place in the world other than in Oxfordshire. And maybe, depending on what sort of business you're looking at starting, it might be relevant to yourselves to be sitting in the right place for where you're doing your various startup. And maybe we can get into that in a little bit more detail later. I actually did a presentation at McKinsey, the big consulting firm, a little bit after we'd done this startup, and they sort of said to me, if you could bottle what you did, we'd sell it. So it's a pretty interesting thing being able to start up a company very fast and deliver in a short space of time. So that's one of the big consulting firms said that they would love to be able to do it. I'll give you a little bit of background on motorsports just so that maybe you can relate to how it may or may not relate to the industry that you're in. It's a sports team. It's also an engineering business. Now, why motorsports? Well, in motorsports, we do a lot of things that I would say are things like lean product development. We have to develop, you might think we spend a lot of money in motorsports, but what we do is we develop many, many products very, very quickly. And we don't just do one design and leave it as it is. We have many, many product iterations over a year. So basically, motorsports has a lot of aspects of lean product design. It's a prototyping competition. So basically, we're really competing on how fast we can make a new prototype that can be compared to our opposition. Motorsports is also about differentiation. So motorsports is used in a differentiation strategy by a business. So if you're a car company, like Mercedes currently in Formula One, you want to differentiate your product from other products in the marketplace, you use motorsports in order to differentiate your product. So many companies, Mercedes, tires, energy drinks, well, that's the new one with obviously Red Bull, but Red Bull uses it more as a danger sport. The other thing about motorsports is execution, and it's a very key part of running a business. One thing in many businesses is if you want to delay the delivery of a product, you can just say, I'll delay the product launch, there's no problem. You don't have huge ramifications, but in motorsport, that doesn't count, because if you want to delay your launch, you won't make it to the race. So one thing about motorsports is it does focus the mind on delivering at certain milestones. Those milestones are your first race. So when we had this 100 days project with Honda and Super Aguri, there was no question about delivering. We had to deliver, otherwise, in this particular case, we would have lost our bond in the racing, which we had to put up $50 million as a bond, and if we didn't deliver on the 100 days, then someone would have lost their bond. So we had something that does help to focus the mind and does help to make you solve problems. One of the other aspects one of the problems we have in terms of finding people to work in our industry is that it is actually a hard job. Not many people like traveling the world. It might sound glamorous, but you do have to fly into a place. You go straight to work in a really hot country. We were in Malaysia last week with 35 degrees and 95% humidity in a garage with some fans, wearing, sadly, clothes that are designed for the UK that you're wearing in Malaysia. So it's not the nicest environment in the world, although it is fun because it is a sport. But one of the aspects that we have problems with is trying to find people that do want to travel and have the potential to travel. So depending on what you may be doing in your business, whether if you're internationally focused, you'll be looking to find people that are willing to travel around the world, which is difficult in itself. So in motor racing, in our particular series, we're in Formula Electric, and we travel to these cities around the world, and every year we do that, and every year we also basically test our cars. When we're not racing, we're doing other work, designing cars and looking to the future. To give you a bit of a sort of a sizing, I suppose, of companies in the motorsports industry, this would be a typical Formula One team. So you have something like 450 people working on the chassis, which is the car, and then maybe another 400 people plus working on the engine. So it's quite a big, when we talk about a team in motorsport, we're not talking about a small company. We're actually talking about, let's say, a mid-sized company. And in this aspect, I would say it's probably the same as a small car company. That's how I would envisage it. The budgets are fairly large, and in Formula One, they operate somewhere between 50 and who knows what the top number is, but could be as high as £500 million a year. So they're quite big businesses in themselves, and as I said, about 7 of them operate out of this region in the Oxfordshire. So that sort of sizes the teams. In Formula Electric at the moment, we're like maybe Formula One was 30 years ago. So we're somewhere in the region of 20 to 30 people. So a whole different size of company, but we still have to do the same job, which is build cars, take them around the world, race them, look for sponsorship, look after sponsors, do advertising, marketing, and sales. So that's pretty much how a typical team will work. The other aspect that I wanted to look at was what I suppose I call X teams. Now, I'm not sure if you can read those graphs, but typically in sports, you can probably say that the highest spending team typically has the highest performance. And that pretty generally works, I suppose, in football, in motor racing, etc. But every so often, there's a team that delivers more for the amount of money that's put in. And I'm sure there's many examples of that in football, and in motorsports, it's the same. And I think what we call that really is X teams, and that's a name I took out of one of the Harvard Business Review report. But it's one of the targets I have, is to can you over deliver for how much money you spend? And for me, that's a big focus in running a company. Super Aguri, when we started Super Aguri, we had an X team definitely, and if you know anything about motor racing, as time went on, the team finished because there was a financial collapse, and Honda pulled out of the world of motor racing, and is back again now. But after we ran that team, part of our team went on to win the World Championship with Brawn in 2009. I'll keep mentioning clusters, and as I said, we are in one in Oxfordshire. And depending on what kind of business that you might be looking at starting up, I'd suggest that you would have a look at looking for areas in which you can work, which would help your business. So, for example, if you were in doing apps, then I would probably try to base my business wherever there's a lot of app companies, because you should be able to get a lot of support from suppliers, and you should be able to find a lot of people in the region where many apps are developed. It's okay to develop things over the internet, but there's nothing like working in the same region as a supplier. One of the things that we also notice in motorsports is a concept called R&D spillover. And what I mean there is, if you're in motorsport and you use a number of suppliers that are similar to your competitors, there is a natural building of capability in that cluster. So if you all use the same IT company, the IT company that's providing you back end should be becoming more efficient, because you're all using the same back end, and you're all teaching that supply company how your industry works. So again, when you're looking at starting up a company, you should be looking at not just building a team internally, but how can you leverage the resources around you at any one time. Some of the other aspects you'll have to look at is things like, what kind of industry am I in? Am I in an incremental innovation industry, or am I in a disruptive market? This would have a big effect on the type of people that you'll be able to entice to come into your company. You may, if you're in a disruptive market, you'll be looking for people that probably take higher risks. So it'll be harder to get people out of, let's say, more conservative, incrementally innovative businesses. Something like I would call SAP, for example. I would say that's an incremental innovation business, where you have a very big piece of software that you're incrementally innovating over time and has much more of a process to it. Whereas if you're starting a company which is to do with maybe robotics or something in Silicon Valley, there's a lot of changes that's happening all the time. You're pivoting all the time on ideas, you're changing direction, And that also takes a certain kind of person that can handle these constant changes in direction. So I would say that you need to look at what kind of business you're operating and what kind of business you're building from that respect. Risk versus reward is another area which you'll have to look at. The higher the risk, as I said, if you're building a disruptive innovation business where you're changing the world, it's going to be difficult to get people to come and follow you, and that's what I'll start to look at in some of the slides further on. So risk versus reward has a big impact on whether or not you're going to have to pay a lot of money for people to come and join your crazy startup, or your startup maybe makes sense and it's a bit easier for people to understand with a lot less risk involved. Now, I think I'll start with some assumptions. I thought I should be saying that I'm not going to be talking about businesses that are very large businesses. I'm focusing in on people that are really starting from scratch with yourself or a couple of other founders. So I'm not looking at big businesses. It needs to be lean, flexible, and focused. And the risk level will be a high decider of what is compared to the norm. So this is just some basic assumptions. I'm not sort of trying to say here about how to build IBM. I'm kind of thinking about something from 0 to 20 or 30 people, and then maybe upwards to a couple of hundred people. Definitely not talking about businesses in the thousands or hundreds of thousands. One of the things that I thought about recently was I spoke at Cambridge about the future of automotive, and it was interesting that in the audience were a lot of graduates like yourselves, and well, I'm 47 and I've been in the automotive business for a long time. When I started in my business, I never thought that electric cars would be something that I would be interested in. I was only interested in petrol cars, and I thought the future was always going to be about petrol cars. One of the things I noticed was there was a couple of other speakers that were talking about the fuel-based industries, so petrol engines. It was actually a Shell conference, and I was surprised that many of the questions I got was, what did I think it was the future? One thing you'll be interested in finding is that I was surprised at how many graduates were thinking about what would they be in 30 years if they wanted to be in, let's say, my position. They wouldn't want to go into an industry which is like, let's say, fuel, because everybody predicts that fuel will be dead in 20 or 30 years when you're in my position. So one of the interesting things that came from that discussion was, what would I want to be? What kind of industry would I want to be in 30 years? And again, you'll be looking for people that want to follow you into what is the future. It's relevant that why I sort of speak about this is because many people are quite conservative, but I think if you have, what they found, I think, in Silicon Valley a little while back, was that people do want to work in an industry they can go home and tell their family about. So if you're doing a startup and you're looking for people, you need to make it enticing to people to join you in your crazy quest or journey to change the world. They need to be able to go home every night and tell somebody else, their partner, etc., why they're doing this crazy adventure, why it's fun, why it's right, why it's relevant. And that was what I think came out of my discussion when I was at Cambridge, was that people were looking for what is the future. They didn't want to just be working in a certain type of person, didn't want to just be working in the norm. And this will be part of the problem that you have, is if you're doing something that's quite radical, is that you need to convince people to come away from their thoughts on maybe joining a large company like a large bank in London, or maybe a large consulting firm, to come and try something pretty crazy, and they'll be potentially worried about their career plans and other things. And it's not just them, it'll be potentially their partner, and maybe even their family will have an influence on what they're doing. So the conservatism of people will have more of an effect on what the future is than you think. So that leads me on to a slide designed about what kind of person are you, what are your goals and your personality type, and what's the direction of the focus of the business, because you're basically going to have to sell in order to get people to join your future project. And I think you have to have a look at a lot of things. For example, there's a number of books that I've read over the years. One of them is, do you want to be rich or king? And that might be, do you want to be the king of a business or do you want to be rich? And what that comes down to is, do you mind that you develop a business that you may not be the CEO of after a few years, or do you really want to control the business and you don't worry so much about how much money you want to make, but more about how much control you have? So there'll be a lot of aspects as to what kind of person are you, what kind of business do you want to develop, and how that will influence how you run the business, at least in the beginning, and therefore why people are maybe following you across into the abyss. So every time when I started the Formula One team, I had to ring up people and basically say, you want to join me, we're going to start a Formula One team, and in 100 days we're going to be on the grid in a country far, far away. Now, many people said, you're crazy, I'd never join that, that'll never happen. It's not possible, but you've got to convince those people to come and join you. And maybe your business might not quite develop quite as quickly as that one did, but it potentially will still be moving at quite a rate that you probably never experienced. I think a few years ago I saw one of the guys doing IT at Facebook. He did a presentation here, and some of his biggest troubles was how fast they had to scale up the servers to support the growth of Facebook. And you can imagine that he had to hire people at a great rate in order to keep ahead of the growth of that company. Now, our motorsport company, it certainly didn't have the growth rate of a startup like Facebook, but we had a different kind of growth rate. We had a very fast growth rate. They had a very long, continuous growth rate. What kind of company do you want to create? Do you want to have decisions made by committees, or do you want to be a dictator? I think I'm more of a dictator than a committee, because in motorsport you've got to make decisions fast and you can't really wait for a committee to make a decision. That's a little bit different to, let's say, a Japanese style company which builds a consensus in order to make a decision. Now that can be very beneficial, and it probably, depending on what kind of industry you're in, maybe you'll have a different style. I think it's important to decide what your personal style is, and you'll have to let people know that you're hiring more about what kind of style you're going to deliver, because they're going to put up with you in the middle of the night, ringing them up, demanding answers, because you're in another country, or that's what I have to do anyway. You're in another country and you need answers to a problem you're having on a race car, and you've got to have people that are willing, or I have to have people that are willing to get up in the middle of the night and help us solve problems far, far away. There's many people that probably will join you that didn't know what they wanted to do. I knew what I wanted to do very early on. When I was 12 years old, I already had a computer. I'm certainly no computer genius, but I certainly knew what I wanted to do. You'll find that you'll have people that want to be not told what to do, but they want to follow somebody who's got a good idea, because they're looking for a direction, and hopefully you're one of the people that can define that direction. So again, what do you want to do? What's your direction? What's your vision? Where are you going? Will be very important to basically selling your company and yourself to potential employees, and it will also form part of the longer ongoing development of the company. I had a different problem actually at one point. For a long time I wanted to be technical director of an F1 team, so I did start an F1 team in order to deliver that vision, but once I'd done that, I actually took a few years to figure out what I wanted to do next. It probably took me about, I suppose, 5 years to go from wanting to be a technical director in an F1 team to looking at the future of my particular industry, which is automotive. And it took me some trips over to San Francisco and Detroit and other places to look at what I thought was the future of my industry. And now, again, I'm very clear about which direction I'm going. It's easier for people to join your vision and to follow the direction when you're very sure about where you're going. And that's something that I'm quite definite about, let's say. The other thing is you probably have to be willing to be embarrassed by your opinion. So when I did start, many of probably the successful startups are a little bit too early for what they are. When I started the F1 team, most people in the industry thought I was crazy, and I heard a lot of stories back from inside some of the teams saying, what the hell are you doing? That'll never work. But once it happened, then people started to join. we actually had a problem to get people to join, which I'll tell you about in the next slide. So you'll have to be credible and try to find ways of convincing people why your new vision is going, and I suppose again you're going to have to sell your vision, your direction, and who you are. That's how you will build the initial teams. So recruitment, and I think maybe we'll touch on some of my thoughts anyway on recruitment. I've listened to a number of talks at sort of these type of events, and a lot of the questions people ask are things like, how did you find your co-founder? How do you find people? How do you find people in the beginning? You know, what's the direction? Maybe you go to Slingshot and find the people like that, so pitch there. What we had to do when we started the F1 team in 2005, we had a problem of how do we become credible really fast. Now, our industry is very small, as I said. We're in the middle of a cluster. So we had to do something crazy. It was before Facebook really was big and LinkedIn and those kind of tools that maybe you could use now. So what we did is we organised a night at a pub in Witney, which is just outside of Oxford, and we invited as many people as we could who we knew would probably help to spread the word. Because one of our problems was that most people thought we were crazy. How the hell could you start a Formula One team in 100 days? It wasn't possible. No one had ever done it. Nobody believed it was possible. So basically we had to first get people to believe we existed. So we turned up at this pub in Witney, and basically invited 20 or 30 people to come and see we were real. They could touch us. They could see we were a team. We had the first 5 or 6 people. They could ask us lots of questions, and that helped to filter down into, let's say, the general industry. And when we put an advertisement in one of the, let's say, one of the journals in motorsport, then people could look at the ad and say, ask their friends, is that real? Do those guys exist? And then it made it easier for us to get people to send their CVs. So we actually had a credibility problem at the beginning to get people to actually believe that they should bother to go for the ads that we had in the newspaper. I don't know if you've had to put an ad in the newspapers in Oxfordshire, but it really is difficult to get people in Oxford area. I believe we have a negative unemployment here, so it's quite hard to actually get people to come and join. And so I suppose it's easier when you're in a cluster, but it's also difficult because there's a big demand on people. And from what I've read, that's probably similar to Silicon Valley. It's difficult to get people away from wanting to go to Google or Apple or Facebook, and in fact, some of the other companies that are not seen as not so cool this week are having trouble keeping people in their businesses. So I think in Silicon Valley they've probably got a whole different level. What kind of people do you want? There's a lot of questions I also see in many of the discussions about A players and B players. I think that's not completely true all the time. Yes, maybe you want always the top of the top, but actually the reality is you won't always get exactly who you want. I've found that it's better, especially in a very small startup, that you may have to take people for a certain role and rejig the organization or the job descriptions to fit maybe their strengths. So you might say, I want to have a finance person that doesn't want to do a certain, or not doesn't want to do, but maybe doesn't have the skills in a certain area. So you may have to adjust the next job that you recruit for that has some crossover skills into one of the areas that they haven't covered. So it's difficult because as you start to develop that company, it's a little bit lopsided in some areas because you've hired someone who has strength in a certain type of engineering, but they don't have strength that you potentially need in a different type of engineering. You've had to hire somebody else, but luckily they cross over into maybe one of the marketing areas. So as you develop your organizational structure, I mean, you'd love to do a perfect, diagram, organogram of your company. We'll have a person here and a person there, but sometimes somebody pops up, you think, well, in 1 year's time, that person might be absolutely perfect. Let's take them now. We'll teach them what they don't know. They'll teach us what we don't know. And maybe we'll have to cross over with this person doing a bit of their job. And for the moment, we'll just have to live with that and try to sort of develop the company. Now that's where communication becomes very important, to say what you're expecting each person to do. But then, of course, it makes it difficult if that person, for example, left, then you've got a funny kind of hole to fit. So then you have to rejig the organization and say, right, we have to maybe get a different job to fit this job here, or we wait till this new person comes along and we'll have to move some of the roles around. So I find that it's not just down to A players, B players that have come out in many of the discussions. It's maybe the direction varies slightly on basically on who you can hire. I worked with a big consulting firm in engineering a few years ago, and I said, how do you define which sectors you work in? And they said, well, basically what really happens is we hire a bunch of new engineers, we find out what they're interested in, and it normally turns out that whatever their passion is, we're strong at. So we might go into an area that's more focused on what, let's say, many of the engineers are interested in, so we vary which things we're selling based on the people we have in our company. So again, you may start a company and you may be going down a certain direction, and you are able to hire certain people and they actually pull your direction of your company in a different way than maybe what you wanted. And so it's not just about who you hire that fits exactly your vision. You may have to alter your vision a little bit along the way. The other big learning experience that I had was you can't have everybody in the organization exactly the same as you. So one of the companies I went to in the past, I was having trouble in the previous company. I'd done a wonderful job, I thought, and I came into this new company and it just wasn't working. And after a while, I actually got a management coach to help me to figure out what had gone wrong. And he said, you know, that everybody's kind of opposite to you. You're a bit crazy, you like doing new ideas all the time, and you're terrible at detail. But you've got a whole department of people that are good at detail. So it's no wonder they think you're crazy. So one of the things that I found when I started Super Aguri was we tried to roughly balance the type of people in the company. So I needed a few people around me that could handle me changing my ideas every 10 minutes, and they could sort of follow that process. But I also needed a lot of people who were really good at the detail, so that when as a group we decided what we were doing, they were very good at saying, right, now Mark, just stop, we'll go and deliver that. And they went and delivered what we needed. So one of the things I would also encourage is looking at things like Myers-Briggs, which is a personality type analysis. So you try and figure out what kind of person are you, what kind of person is maybe your co-founder, what kind of person are you missing, and then you, at least when you're doing interviews looking for the next person in your organization, you're looking for, again, as I said before, cross skills. Maybe you've got somebody in operations who's actually quite good at, not HR in particular, but talking to people. So that person can help with the HR function when you don't actually have an HR department. So if you're having trouble speaking to someone who's having trouble, you say, you know what, you'd be better to speak to that person than me because I'd be too aggressive, for example. So you can read up on things like Myers-Briggs. It makes you, that's a personality type analysis. I think nowadays you can do it on the internet. I know you're supposed to have all the right training, etc., but at least if you're a startup, you can just at least start to try and position yourself and people in different positions. So I'd encourage you to look at those kind of things. The other thing is trying to do a really rough skills matrix. And what I mean by a skills matrix is, let's say you have 2 or 3 people, you put down their names, you look at all the different types of departments you dream about having in the future when you're a bigger company, and you try and figure out what at least yourself and the first few people are good at. Let's say I'm good at engineering, one of my colleagues is much better at finance, I'm not so good at HR, he's better at HR, and so I'm okay at IT. So we kind of look at what we can do. So as we start up, we sort of say there's no reason to maybe hire an IT person initially because I can cover that for the moment. But as soon as we get a bit bigger, we're going to have somebody that does IT. But the next engineer that comes along, maybe you say, oh, he's actually quite good at IT, so we can double up a job there while we're growing. So again, if you do a skills matrix and figure out how and where you need the skills, what you're good at, and as you grow, you can keep trying to fill in the blanks as you grow. So you don't necessarily need to have an IT person or a graphics designer or something like that. The other thing that people probably forget about is that nowadays we talk a lot about lean startups, and one of the things that I've used a lot is things like people per hour. I don't know if you've seen that, but on the internet you can hire someone to do a logo design for £50. You can hire someone to set up your website for £25. You can ask for someone to fix your website for a certain amount of money. So again, as you start up, don't necessarily look to hire a legal department, an IT department, a something department. You can probably find ways of chopping and changing and manipulating that. The other thing in the UK that's maybe potentially a little bit different to some countries is that there's a lot more contractors. So again, you could hire contractors on a short-term basis. If you're trying to do a big presentation or a new website, you might hire a contractor to help you start up the graphics department. But you know what? You don't need a graphics department maybe all the time, so you can just hire someone for a short period. So you need to look at designing your skills matrix over time, as well as so your skills matrix over time may only need people at certain times. So again, as you start up, when you're really small and cash is really tight, you need to find ways of being creative to spread around the risk. Now there's a little bit of team building. This is a picture here of us when we first started the Formula One team. It probably doesn't look so rubbish, but it was a bit rubbish at the first races. We made lots of mistakes. The team didn't know each other. We hadn't figured out how we all worked together. And then on the right, that was when we got a lot slicker. So let's say in the first one, maybe it took us 4 seconds to change all the wheels and refuel the car. And the second one, it took us 3.6 seconds. It doesn't sound like much, but it's enough potentially in this particular realm to beat the opposition. There's a good lot of videos on the internet by a guy called Dan Pink, who talks a lot about drive. And what he means there is, drive is, how do we get people to work harder for us? How do we get a team to work better together? And a lot of the things that he talks about are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So as you get bigger, how do you motivate a team to work really hard all the time? So when you're doing 80-hour weeks, how do you get everybody else to do 80-hour weeks with you? And a lot of it is down to empowering people, giving them autonomy, giving them direction, and that they have a purpose and they can go out and fulfill what they need to do without having to ask you all the time. Allowing innovation to shine through is one of the most difficult things, so that you don't get caught up in all the details. So I'd definitely say have a look at Dan Pink's stuff. It's really quite interesting. What are we trying to do every day? I said before about somebody might say, I'd rather work at Google than I would work at GM because Google's doing stuff to change the world. Maybe they're doing stuff to change the world in maybe the direction you don't agree with nowadays, but certainly there's a lot of interesting, sustainable entrepreneurial activities here. And you might want to look at how you have something that employees really believe in. So again, going back to a previous slide, your vision for the future and why you're doing it, your story is very important for people to follow you and want to do what you're doing, what you're passionate about. Another one, again, I'll just touch on fairly quickly is culture. Now, some people probably say you shouldn't just touch on culture. What comes first? I've had people tell me that culture comes first before strategy. Strategy is before culture. I do believe that the culture of a company does come from the CEO and the founders. So what you do and the way you behave and the way you deal with people and the way you're maybe aggressive or not aggressive, the way, if you look at Uber for as an example, it seems to me that the CEO is quite aggressive, so I'm imagining that the whole company is quite aggressive in the way they go about things, whereas you might look at something maybe like the Body Shop, maybe that company is a little bit more like its founder. So culture, team building, the way you define your company comes a lot from you, and it will define about how people work for you. One of the things that I've done over the past, I work for a company called Arrows, I felt the guy that used to run that was a guy called Tom Walkinshaw, and I felt he was very entrepreneurial. Whereas when I worked at McLaren, it's a lot more about professionalism and corporate culture. Completely different cultures. When we started Super Aguri, I wanted to take the professionalism of McLaren and join it with the entrepreneurial nature of Arrows, and we went about telling people that's what we wanted to achieve all the time. So we tried to create a company that was a mixture of professionalism and entrepreneurship. And again, that's something that I talked a lot about. Another one here I've got is titles. I don't know whether you've heard people say about titles. You'll see a lot of American companies with vice presidents and all sorts of malarkey in their names. How important are titles? I would say titles are more important for your next job than the current job. So I think people in your company know what you do, but you may want to have a certain title so that it makes it easier for the next job you go for someone to put you in a pigeonhole. So I think probably over the years I've probably asked for certain titles because I knew that in the long run it would help me to explain what I did to the next job I went for. So some people say, oh, don't worry about titles, but you know what? Sometimes it's important to people. So I don't mind if people want to change their titles to something fancy. But at the same time with titles, I've also written down here, respect is interesting because if you have a title, you don't earn respect by just having a title. So one thing to not forget is if you make a new employee vice president of the world, then that person's still got to earn the respect of that name. The title might be important for their next job, but actually in the position they're in the company you're in at the time, it'll be much more important to earn that respect. Communication. All the time at our first race this year, we had a few problems and we kind of went back and worked on communication. One thing that a colleague of mine used to say is that you can communicate something, but if the other person doesn't hear, it's not communicated. And so you shouldn't forget that. One of my mantras I often say is emails don't work. And everyone says, what do you mean emails don't work? Well, emails don't work if no one reads them. So I've worked with many people who say, I sent you an email. Yeah, but I didn't read it. I've got 1,000 emails. So that's very important when you talk about communication is don't just send out more and more information. You have to find ways of properly communicating what you actually want to say. Communication is also interesting when there's a lack of information. So some people don't want to tell anybody in their company about what's happening, so they often say, oh, I won't tell the people about this next change or what's happening next. But you know what? Whenever there's a vacuum, people just fill that vacuum with rumor and hearsay. So when you talk about communication and team building, you've got to make sure that you do communicate as much as you possibly can, of course, without giving away trade secrets. But when you don't communicate something, people make it up. So that's where you get Hello magazines and everything that have all of the rumors because they're filling in the blanks that people don't know the answer to. So you should think about that. One of my biggest things is blame culture. I hate a blame culture, but it is very hard to keep that down. But one of the easiest things that I find there is if anyone says, I told you so, then you can say, well, then it's your fault. Because if you knew, you should have told me. And if you didn't tell me, then it must be your fault. So that's one of the quick ways of getting rid of a blame culture. But it's quite hard to fight against, actually, but it's important to stop. And I think the last thing is that, clear communication can do wonders for a malfunctioning team. You'll probably find a lot of the problems other people don't know what they're supposed to be doing. They've assumed what they're doing. Assumption is the mother of all mistakes. You can fill in that word there. We use that quite a lot. So when people assume things and haven't been communicated to properly, that's usually where many of the errors come. And if you've got through all of that, and hopefully you've developed a team and you've recruited people and you've found the right people, then you've got to have a look at building some boring processes and procedures. Even when you're a small company, you'll have to start putting in some of these boring processes and procedures, because when you hopefully get your first A round, B round, etc. funding, the people that are putting that money in won't want you to be a ragtag bunch of unorganized people. You need to have started to put in some processes. My uncle once said to me, you should think about a company as you're pushing a rock up a hill. The qualities and processes and procedures are the kind of wedge you put into that rock. So you can stop and breathe for a minute and the company doesn't just collapse when you stop. So the processes and procedures, the job descriptions, organizational diagrams, that's all important stuff. That's what you're doing to embed knowledge in your company for the future. So when you do receive that first few million of your A rounds, you'll be very organised and you'll be able to make your investors feel calm about their future with yourselves. So in summary, building a startup is difficult, as we said before. It's a mind-boggling process, but I love it. Getting people to join you on your journey is one of the most important things, and I think you could see from my speech today, that's what I believe is one of the key aspects. It's easier to start up in a cluster. So again, look at where maybe your particular business has its natural cluster, and don't forget process and procedure, even though it's boring in an entrepreneurial activity. So that's it. That's my presentation for tonight. I hope that was helpful. I think we have questions.
Thank you, Mark. Does anybody have any questions right now? Yep, coming to you.
Mark, maybe you can just explain a little bit about when you said you started Super Aguri, you tried to bring together the entrepreneurial side as well as that sort of more professional side. What do you mean by that?
What do I mean by that? Risk-taking, I think, and people coming out of their pigeonholes. So when you're in more of a corporate culture, you don't allow people to step out of their roles and experiment. But when you're in more of an entrepreneurial company, there's a little bit more flexibility around each role. So I'll give you an example of a friend who went to a particular Formula One team, and he had a lot of experience in a certain area, but he wasn't allowed to use that experience because he was in a pigeonhole. Now, at a more entrepreneurial team, they would have said, "Oh, I didn't know you'd done that before. Come over here and help us." So I think this probably goes back to this job description role, letting things sort of move around a bit, job descriptions, and don't keep somebody in a particular place. When you become a very large company, you can't have people jumping around and doing things "Oh, I'm in IT, I feel like doing something in HR today." But when you're only in, sort of a couple of hundred people, you can probably let people move a little bit in their roles and be a little bit more flexible.
Mark, I have a quick question, which is that preceding lectures have talked about that before you start a business, you're effectively changing the world or something, that you're going to solve this major problem. How does that fit with starting another Formula One team? Because presumably there's 12 cars racing around and then you make a 13th or whatever. So I'm just trying to reconcile what you've told us tonight with some of the other things I've heard earlier in the course.
Because it was impossible. So we did something that everyone said wasn't possible when we did the F1 team. So that was pretty much our catch cry in the beginning, was that we're doing something that nobody said was possible. Yeah. That was a pretty big rallying cry. We used to have, what do we have? I think in every room in the building we had this, like a piece of paper that said 21 days to go, 10 days to go. And it was amazing how it focused people's minds. So as a project, it was quite a challenge. And as I said, that's why the McKinseys of the world said, if you could bottle that, that'll be something we could sell.
We've probably got time for one more question, if there is anybody with anything. Oh, yeah. 2 seconds. Hello, I was very impressed with the presentation. What I want to know, in terms of your inspirational sort of team people, what was coming to my mind was Shackleton and how he recruited the team. Nobody died, and they didn't actually achieve exactly what they wanted. Mm-hmm. As in, you didn't say, we will win Formula One.
Yep.
We will have a Formula One team.
Yep.
So who inspires you?
Oh, you mean in historically? Maybe my grandfather, you mean? Who raced cars? I haven't got one of those pictures in my So your grandfather? My grandfather, yeah. Who used to have all sports cars back in the 1920s and 30s. Growing up on a farm, it's a kind of like an interesting way of looking at cars and building things.
Okay, well, Mark is going to be sticking around for the drinks. So please help yourself to a glass of wine or anything else. And please join me in thanking Mark once again. Thank you.